What you are watching unfold right now in the Strait of Hormuz is not a military skirmish. It is not a diplomatic disagreement. It is something far deeper, far more consequential, and far more dangerous than the headlines are letting on. Because when you strip away the press releases, the presidential tweets, and the Pentagon briefings, what you are actually witnessing is the beginning of a restructuring of the entire global order. And the Strait of Hormuz is the hinge on which that restructuring turns. Think about what that narrow corridor of water actually represents. About 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade and 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas passed through this strait before this conflict began. That is not just a shipping lane, that is the circulatory system of the modern industrial world. And right now, US aircraft are hovering over it while the IRGC is issuing warnings that no foreign force, and they mean American forces specifically, will approach that waterway without consequences. Let that sink in for a moment, because that is the world we are now living in. Now let's talk about how we actually got here, because the story the media is giving you is so thin, so stripped of context, that it borders on deliberate misdirection. To understand the Hormuz standoff happening right now in May of 2026, you have to go back and understand the sequence of decisions, escalations, and catastrophic miscalculations that brought two of the world's most heavily armed forces to the edge of open naval warfare in one of the most economically sensitive waterways on the planet. This conflict began on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched an air war against Iran and assassinated Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Now think about what that means. That the head of a sovereign nation-state, a man who led a country of nearly 90 million people, was killed in a targeted military operation. The Iranian response was not slow, and it was not symbolic. Iran launched missile and drone attacks on Israel, US military bases, and US allied Gulf states. The IRGC moved immediately to weaponize the one asset they had always held in reserve, the Strait of Hormuz. And they did so with a ruthlessness and efficiency that caught a lot of Western analysts off guard. And yet, if you had been paying attention, none of this should have surprised you. Iran had telegraphed this move for years. The only question was always whether they would actually pull the trigger. They did. The IRGC issued warnings forbidding passage through the strait, boarded and attacked merchant ships, and laid sea mines in the strait. Sea mines, in the 21st century, in a waterway that handles a quarter of the world's oil trade. This is not the behavior of a country that was easily intimidated by maximum pressure campaigns or by the presence of aircraft carrier strike groups in the Persian Gulf. This is the behavior of a government that made a strategic calculation, that the pain they could inflict on the global economy by closing this waterway would exceed the pain they would receive from continued US and Israeli airstrikes. And looking at what has happened to oil prices and gas prices at the American pump, you would have to say that calculation was not wrong. On March 19th, Dubai crude oil prices reached $166 per barrel, the highest on record, surpassing every previous peak, exceeding every earlier benchmark. Let that number sit with you for a moment, let it register fully, let it sink in beyond the surface. The highest on record, not a routine fluctuation, not a temporary spike, but a historic extreme. And as a direct consequence, California gasoline prices exceeded $5 per gallon in the second week of March, crossing a psychological threshold, moving into territory that affects daily life in a tangible way. Now, as of this week, US gas prices have skyrocketed from an average of $2.98 a gallon before the war started to $4.46 a gallon, a sharp increase, a rapid escalation that reflects the broader shock. That is not a statistic, not just a number on a chart, not an abstract data point. That is a tax on every American family, every small business owner, every truck driver, every farmer, a cost that is unavoidable, a burden that is widely distributed. That is the cost of this conflict landing directly on the kitchen table of ordinary American people who were never asked whether they wanted this war in the first place, who are now absorbing its consequences regardless. And now let's talk about what is happening right now, today, in May of 2026, not in theory, not in projection, but in the present moment as it unfolds. Because this is where it gets genuinely alarming, where the situation moves from concerning to dangerous. Trump announced Project Freedom, a plan to guide merchant ships through the Strait of Hormuz, a proposal framed as a solution, presented as a response to a growing crisis. It sounds reasonable on the surface, it appears practical at first glance, it suggests order in the face of disruption. Ships are stuck, unable to move, unable to complete their routes, seafarers are stranded, caught in place, unable to leave or proceed. About 20,000 seafarers have been stranded in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz, according to the International Chamber of Shipping, a significant number, a human reality behind the statistics. 20,000 human beings stuck at sea on vessels they cannot move because the water they need to cross has become a war zone, transformed from a passage into a point of danger. These are real people, individuals with lives, families, obligations. These are not abstractions, not faceless figures in a report. These are sailors from the Philippines, from India, from Bangladesh, from Ukraine, who signed contracts to move oil and goods around the world and found themselves caught in the middle of a geopolitical conflict they had nothing to do with, drawn into a situation they did not choose, bearing risks they did not create. So Trump launches Project Freedom, moving forward with a plan framed as protection and stability, and the Iranian response was immediate and unambiguous, direct, clear, leaving no room for reinterpretation or delay. The head of the Iranian Parliament's National Security Commission, Ebrahim Azizi, warned that any U.S. interference in the maritime regime of the Strait of Hormuz will be considered a violation of the ceasefire, stating it plainly, defining the boundary in unmistakable terms. He didn't hedge, he didn't soften the message, he didn't leave space for diplomatic maneuvering, he didn't suggest it was open to interpretation, didn't imply flexibility or conditionality. He said interference would be a ceasefire violation, full stop, a line that once crossed would carry consequences. And then, within hours of that warning being issued, within that same narrow window of time, Iran launched missile and drone attacks on U.S. forces and merchant vessels in the Strait of Hormuz on Monday, May 4th, moving from warning to action with speed. The attack, described by the Washington Post as the most significant threat to date to the fragile ceasefire, came at a moment when the entire architecture of the diplomatic arrangement between the U.S. and Iran was already showing severe stress fractures, already under pressure, already close to breaking. The U.S. military blew up 6 small Iranian boats in the Strait of Hormuz after Iran launched multiple cruise missiles, drones, and small boats at U.S. Navy ships and at commercial ships being protected by the U.S. military, escalating the exchange, reinforcing the cycle of action and response. Now think about the optics of that sentence very carefully. Consider what it conveys. Consider how it reads when laid out plainly. The United States Navy is in the Strait of Hormuz, present, active, engaged. Iran is firing cruise missiles and drones and sending small attack boats at U.S. Navy ships, initiating direct confrontation. The U.S. is blowing up Iranian boats in response, answering force with force, action with action, and at the same time, both sides are technically in a ceasefire, still operating under that label, still nominally within that framework. Does that sound like a ceasefire to you? Does that resemble what the word is supposed to mean? Does that align with any conventional understanding? Does that description match the word ceasefire in any way that makes sense, in any way that holds together under scrutiny? When pressed by a radio host whether the ceasefire with Iran was over and whether strikes could resume as soon as Monday night, Trump told him, "Well, I can't tell you that," offering no clarity, no confirmation, no definitive answer. Think about that. Consider the implication. Consider what it reveals. The President of the United States cannot tell you whether a ceasefire is in effect or not, cannot state clearly whether hostilities are paused or ongoing. That is the level of coherence and stability we are dealing with in this crisis right now. That is the degree of uncertainty at the highest level. And this is not me being partisan or political, not an interpretation shaped by bias. This is me reading you what the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Armed Forces actually said to a reporter while US and Iranian forces were exchanging fire in one of the most strategically critical waterways on the planet, stating plainly what was said in the middle of an active confrontation. The commander of Iran's highest operational command unit, Major General Ali Abdullahi, warned that the Iranian armed forces will target any foreign forces, particularly from the US military, that attempt to approach or enter the strategic Hormuz Strait. He said this on May 4th, 2026, yesterday. This is not historical information. This is real time. He was not speaking in diplomatic language designed to leave room for interpretation. He warned that any foreign armed force, especially the aggressor US Army, will be attacked if they attempt to approach and enter the Strait of Hormuz without coordination of the Iranian armed forces. And then he added something remarkable. He accused the US of piracy and theft in international waters. He said the Iranian nation has proven in practice that they respond in a severe and regret-inducing manner to any threat or act of aggression. That is the language of a military commander who believes he is fighting a just war, who believes his country has been attacked and who is willing to escalate if the pressure continues. Now here is the part that I want you to really think about, the part that almost never gets discussed in American mainstream media, and that is the actual strategic logic of Iran's position. Because when you look at this from Tehran's perspective, the logic is not irrational. It is actually quite coherent. Iran watched the United States and Israel assassinate their supreme leader. They watched their country get bombed. They watched their nuclear facilities get struck. And then they looked at their hand and said, what leverage do we have? What can we do that will actually force the other side to take us seriously? And the answer was the Strait of Hormuz. Because Iran cannot win a conventional military war against the United States and Israel. They know that. But they can make the cost of that war extraordinarily high for the entire world, including for the United States. And that is exactly what they have done. As Iran chokes commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, the US-Israeli war with Iran is costing the European Union almost 500 million euros, approximately $600 million every day, raising prices at the pump and fears of a jet fuel shortage within weeks. $600 million a day for Europe alone, that is not collateral damage. That is strategic economic warfare being conducted by a country that has been bombed, sanctioned, isolated, and pushed to the edge, and is now using the one lever it has left to impose costs on the people who pushed it there. You can agree or disagree with Iran's government. You can have any number of opinions about the IRGC, but if you're trying to understand what is actually happening here, you have to start by understanding that Iran's strategy is not crazy. It is desperate, it is dangerous, but it is strategically coherent. Until now, US warships had avoided the strait, as Navy officials had previously described it as an Iranian kill box filled with numerous threats, including anti-ship missiles, drones, fast attack boats, and mines. And given how narrow the strait is, projectiles can be fired from close distances and provide little time for a defensive response. The people inside the US military establishment who actually understand naval warfare have been aware of this vulnerability for years. The Strait of Hormuz is approximately 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. That is not a lot of water. Anti-ship missiles can be launched from Iranian soil, from Iranian islands, from IRGC fast boats, from submarines, from drones. The US Navy is extraordinarily powerful in open ocean warfare. In a confined, mine-laden, drone-saturated choke point a few miles from Iranian territory, that advantage compresses dramatically. And this is the core of the strategic problem that Washington is now facing. Some of Trump's allies have encouraged him to resume the bombing campaign inside Iran, arguing the US has already weakened the regime and insisting the time was ripe to further degrade its military capabilities. Senator Lindsey Graham was already calling for a forceful response to Iran this weekend. The hawkish wing of American foreign policy is looking at this situation and seeing an opportunity to finish what they started. But what would finishing it actually look like? What does victory in the Strait of Hormuz actually mean in practical terms? Because destroying Iran's military capacity does not automatically reopen the strait. Iran has already shown that even a significantly degraded military can lay mines, operate drones, and fire missiles from coastal positions. The geography of the strait does not change just because you bomb more targets. Gregory Brew, a senior analyst on Iran and the energy sector at political risk firm Eurasia Group, said that while the US blockade does appear to be damaging Iran's economy, there is little evidence so far that it has done much to change the Iranian regime's calculus. This is the part that the proponents of maximum pressure have never been able to adequately explain. If the pain inflicted on Iran does not change Iran's behavior, what is the theory of victory? You can sanction a country into economic ruin. You can bomb its military infrastructure. You can blockade its ports. And if the government and the armed forces of that country decide they would rather fight than capitulate, then you have not won. You have just created a more dangerous and more desperate adversary. And now let's talk about the global dimension of this crisis, because the Hormuz standoff is not just an American problem. It is not just a Middle Eastern problem. It is a problem for the entire global economy. A senior Iranian lawmaker earlier renewed a lingering threat by Tehran to ask the Islamic Republic's allies in Yemen, the well-armed Houthi rebel movement, to target shipping in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait if the blockade is not lifted. The Bab el-Mandeb is the other end of the energy corridor that connects the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. If Iran activates the Houthis in Yemen to block that waterway as well, you are now talking about both of the world's most critical energy choke points being disrupted simultaneously. Think about what that would do to oil prices. Think about what that would do to global food prices because diesel powers agriculture. Think about what that would do to supply chains that are already under enormous stress from years of disruption. Oil prices rose and stocks fell on concerns about the safety of transiting the critical waterway. An oil market expert told CNN that average U.S. gas prices could reach $5 a gallon if the strait remains closed. But $5 a gallon is actually the optimistic scenario. If the strait remains closed for months, if negotiations fail, if Trump decides to resume the bombing campaign, if Iran activates the Houthis, in that scenario, you are not talking about $5 gas. You are talking about economic disruption on a scale that the American public has not experienced in living memory. And the people who would feel it first and hardest are not the people in Washington making these decisions. They are the families in the Midwest filling up their pickup trucks. They are the small business owners watching their operating costs explode. They are the retirees watching inflation eat into their fixed incomes. Now, I want to talk about the diplomatic dimension, because this is where I think the story is actually most interesting and most underreported. After more than 5 weeks of fighting, the United States and Iran agreed on April 7th and 8th to a ceasefire that included Israel, brokered by Pakistan, not the UN Security Council, not NATO, not the G7. Pakistan brokered this ceasefire. Think about what that tells you about the realignment of global diplomacy. The traditional Western-led institutions, the ones that have managed international conflict for decades, were not the ones who pulled these two countries back from the brink. It was Pakistan, a country with deep ties to both the Muslim world and to China, that stepped in and created the conditions for a pause in the fighting. That is not a small thing. That is a signal about where diplomatic weight and leverage actually resides in the world right now. J.D. Vance and Iranian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf engaged in what was described as the highest-level direct engagement between the United States and Iran since the 1979 Iranian Revolution. That is a remarkable sentence. For 47 years, the United States and Iran have essentially refused to talk at the highest levels of government, and now, driven by the mutual catastrophe of this conflict, they are sitting across the table from each other. The question is whether anyone on either side is actually willing to offer terms that the other can accept. Iran's plan calls for non-aggression guarantees, the lifting of the U.S. naval blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, and an end to the war on all fronts, including in Lebanon. The United States has called Iran's proposal unacceptable, and yet both sides are still technically in a ceasefire while simultaneously firing at each other in the strait. This is what passes for diplomacy in 2026. Trump's highly anticipated visit to Beijing next week could also complicate his decision to resume the war with Iran. China has called for reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, where much of the energy products it relies upon pass through. Arriving in Beijing with the conflict at best unresolved, or at worst raging yet again, could place Trump in a weakened position in his talks with Chinese leader Xi Jinping. And here is where the geopolitical chessboard gets genuinely complex, because China is not a passive bystander in this crisis. China is the largest importer of Iranian oil. China has enormous economic exposure to continued disruption of energy flows through the Strait of Hormuz, and China is also engaged in high-stakes trade negotiations with the United States. These two crises, the Iran war and the US-China trade confrontation, are not separate. They are intertwined. The decisions made in the Strait of Hormuz will affect the negotiating atmosphere in Beijing and vice versa. What I find most striking about this entire situation is the degree to which the United States appears to have entered this conflict without a fully developed theory of what the end state looks like. You can bomb Iran, you can impose a naval blockade, you can send destroyers through the Strait of Hormuz with their AIS transponders turned on as a demonstration of resolve. The USS Michael Murphy and the USS Frankie Peterson transited the strait, with the Michael Murphy turning on its automatic identification system, which US Navy ships do not typically do, in order to demonstrate that they had sailed through. That is a powerful symbolic gesture. But symbolism does not reopen a waterway that is still full of Iranian mines. Symbolism does not resolve a ceasefire that is being violated in real time. Symbolism does not bring $4 gas back down to $3, and symbolism does not address the underlying grievances and strategic interests that caused this conflict to begin in the first place. The deeper truth here, the thing that I believe is genuinely important for you to understand, is that the Strait of Hormuz crisis is revealing the limits of American military power in a very specific and very important way. The United States has the most powerful navy in the world. It has aircraft carriers and destroyers and submarines and Apache helicopters and electronic warfare systems, and it is still struggling to safely escort a handful of commercial vessels through a 21-mile wide stretch of water. That is not an indictment of the US military. It is an observation about the nature of geographic and strategic constraints. Some problems cannot be solved by superior firepower alone. Some problems require you to understand and respond to the legitimate interests of the other party. And the longer that lesson takes to learn, the more expensive this crisis becomes for everyone, including and especially the American families paying for it at the pump every single day. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi wrote that the US should be wary of being dragged back into a quagmire by ill-wishers and dismissed Washington's Project Freedom plan, writing, "Project Freedom is Project Deadlock." And whatever you think of Iran's foreign minister, that phrase is worth sitting with, Project Deadlock, because that is functionally what the Strait of Hormuz has become, a deadlock that neither side has found a way to break, that is costing the world economy hundreds of millions of dollars every day, that has stranded 20,000 sailors at sea, that has pushed American gas prices to levels not seen in years, and that has brought US and Iranian military forces into direct kinetic contact in one of the world's most dangerous waterways. The aircraft hovering over Hormuz right now are not the beginning of this story. They are somewhere in the middle of it, and how it ends, whether through diplomacy, through escalation, or through some catastrophic miscalculation that neither side intended, is the most important question in global geopolitics right now.